Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress, and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 29, Common Grounds, the Neat and Sound Worth of Grassroots Growth. A study in how the way systems are constituted matters to the resilience and robustness of all organization. When we seek to understand how innovation works, how it could lead to lasting improvements in the story of human progress, we have to explore what are the sources of that innovation? Where or from what different directions does the impetus for innovation come from? I'd like to think I've been doing this satisfactorily enough already, but today, let's take a closer look at a certain dichotomy I've hinted at now and then with regard to this question. This matters because it also goes to the very heart of organization, all organization.
But of course, we first join our fictional friends once more.
Brian is in a bit of a tight spot. There's a hole in the roof of his hut. And the mother-in-law is visiting? The next afternoon, if the mother-in-law arrives to see this gaping hole when she looks up, she's gonna blow the roof. At least metaphorically. And the roof is going to cave in. Brian will never be able to dig himself out of this hole. Again, at least until. But he needs another man to help him fix the thatch. So he goes up to Steve. He's like, "Buddy, I need your help, you see." So Steve says he'll help, and they resolve that the next morning, first thing, they'll both go up the roof and fix the whole thing. A few hours of work at most. Steve's like, "Yeah, man, sure thing." And so the next morning, Brian's waiting for Steve, and Steve doesn't turn up. He waits and waits, and then goes around looking for him. But he just can't find Steve. There isn't going to be much time left before the stern voice of the dreaded mother-in-law would soon fill his ears and shatter his life. Brian is starting to panic. And it's just at that moment that his trusty tail-wagster Bruno is like, "Woof woof." He wants to take Brian somewhere. Brian's like, "Not now, Bruno." But Bruno manages to convince Brian to follow him. And they go down that other path into the open field, and there he is. Steve lolling on the grass with Iris the cat. As you can imagine, Brian is furious. He walks up to Steve, and there ensues a war of words. The commotion eventually gets Brenda and Irene at the scene. They sit them all down and start to talk it out. Brian's like, "Well, Steve promised me last night he'd help fix the roof. I thought we had an agreement." Steve retorting, "Well, Iris wanted to play with me, dude." Irene turns to Brian and asks, "Brian, what actually made you think Steve was even serious about this promise?" Brian has no answer, and then Brenda chips in, "Right. The next time there is to be an agreement, you put something of value on the table. Steve, get that favorite ale mug of yours." Despite Steve's initial protestations, they all soon agree that this is only fair. And Brenda and Irene suggest that hereafter Steve and Brian shall make their agreements in their presence, and Bruno, and possibly Iris too. Furthermore, the ladies offer to hold on to the ale mug until Steve delivers on his part of the bargain. And thus, they live happily ever after. Wait, but what happened when the mother-in-law got there? I hear you ask. You can find out here in this footnote. Making minds meet. So yes, I am here referring to the whole concept of agreements, disputes, and such like. Specifically, the concept of the contract. We largely don't stop to think about this, but if we now do, having followed this story, there is the consideration of what in legal terminology is called a consideration. That ale mug that Steve was made to put down is analogous to the formal concept of consideration. It's part of an old practice to show that you have skin in the game. Again, of course, the contemporary situation around such legal matters is advanced and complex. But let's go back to some of its origins. Let's go back to early Anglo-Saxon Britain, around the years 500 to 550 or so. Anglo-Saxon society in its earliest days didn't use much or any writing. That's something that systematically emerges a bit later. This was the situation in much of Europe with the decline of the Roman Empire in what we call the Dark Ages. Similarly, there existed no such thing as a unified single kingdom of England. It takes a few centuries of convulsions for that to emerge as well. In this early period, there was a wide motley of groups and tribes of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes that had only recently settled much of Great Britain, from the River Forth, near what's today Edinburgh, Scotland, all the way to the southern tip of the island. We tend to think of non-literate societies as barbarous. But I hope I've done my bit to lay to rest that misnotion when we discuss this question in the two-part series in episode 25. Indeed, the current group of people, the Anglo-Saxons, can also trace their descent back to the Proto-Indo-Europeans in cultural, genetic, and especially linguistic terms. But that's not my main point here. However, there are some correspondences in how society was managed and, in this much later case, how it further evolved, and that's what we shall see here.
Wedding words.
These Anglo-Saxon groups, despite a bloody start, began to over time develop or refine more cohesive ways of managing social affairs, not unlike the ghostis and similar institutions that we saw develop under the Proto-Indo-Europeans and some descended peoples. The early Anglo-Saxon arrangements were not written down and therefore appear to be somewhat informal to us. But just as we saw in those cases, these were taken seriously by the people and societies where they developed. So yes, the idea of two individuals having a meeting of the minds and agreeing on something is at the very root of such developments. And as we have seen in our fictional enactment, this would have originated rather informally at first. But circumstances, especially what was at stake, eventually necessitated more formal approaches. This could be practical, as we've seen in the deposition of the ale mug as collateral in the story, but also symbolic or ceremonial, such as putting down sticks or spears. In fact, such a stick has been connected to the stake just mentioned. The stakes were probably literal. Also, this ceremonial act of offering a token done in the presence of external witnesses was called wed, meaning a pledge. So yes, a wedding as we know it is fundamentally an act of pledging. Compare also wager, which is cognate to wed. This term in its dual connotation goes right back to Proto-Indo-European. Wed, seen also, for example, in Sanskrit. Badhu, bride, literally, the one that's pledged. The key point of all this is that it developed by way of customs and practices amongst the people, the common people. Eventually, the kings that rose to prominence in what would eventually become England went on to use the apparatus of the state to only make official these very same practices. Courts would arbitrate when such disputes arose out of such arrangements. Disputes which in earlier days, and even later, were often managed just by the wider community, with, let's say, the blessing of the state. What is of interest to us is that the kings did not necessarily come up with a new set of rules. In cases where existing custom dictated how things should be done, the kings went along in good part, as I said, only reinforcing existing practice. And as we'll see, that made all the difference.
1066 and all that.
Things changed dramatically when in 1066, William the Duke of Normandy defeated the Anglo-Saxon King of England, Harold Godwinson, at the Battle of Hastings to take control of the realm. Most of us know how this story then goes. The Norman French-speaking William, also called William the Bastard, don't ask me, landed in England along with his Norman French-speaking elite, who took over after wreaking much destruction upon the land. With this Frenchy noblery enjoying their beef and mutton in their ivory towers while the peasants on the ground reared cow and sheep. Bœuf and mouton are in fact just the French words for cow and sheep. What's interesting, more relevantly here, however, is that since William, also known as William the Conqueror, had a claim to the throne of England, he wanted to show the local populace that he was not, in fact, a conqueror. So it is said, he promised to retain Anglo-Saxon customs and practices, including an explicit promise to restore the laws of their last king, Edward the Confessor. However, the Normans were great consolidators of power. This was an alien land in many ways, and they had to go about stamping their authority on a population they couldn't even speak the language of. We just saw two juicy examples above. So aside from the great castles that sprung up all over England as an expression of Norman supremacy, there arose measures to formalize the legal system under the new Norman setup. But this they did simply by largely accepting the existing body of legal custom, including practices such as we explored above, and this, what is called common law.
The Norman course of things.
So yes, right from the day the new Norman state established this legal system in England, there was that inherent, shall we say, irony. Since the Norman kings were making this the official system, in that sense, it was central. But given how they originated, how it used to be practiced in Anglo-Saxon times, and indeed, how it continued to operate in Norman England, it was anything but central. I'm not going to get into the intricacies of a legal system here, just as much as I didn't get into the intricacies of grammar in certain previous episodes, but let's briefly look at one or two defining features of common law. A key one is the concept of precedent. Common law is judge-made law. It's the organically accumulated body of law made over time. This is in contrast to civil law, where the state expressly legislates. A core aspect of precedent is that when a new case is similar to an old one, the decisions are based on or aligned with the reasoning of the, preceding case. In theory, at least, there is a binding precedent in such cases.
The great big Dear John letter.
We have seen that in its own peculiar way in England, long-standing customs and practices thus continued to have legal force, largely unchanged by the new state that sought to centralize many aspects of the new realm. Things came to a head when one of the kings was seen to be blatantly violating such custom and precedent, and something had to be done. So a group of influential barons cornered sad King John and got him to expressly agree to stick to custom, or else. This is that long list of rules in a great big document he was forced to sign. At 15 minutes past noon, what we of course know as the Magna Carta, just as with the officialization of existing legal customs by the early Norman kings of England, the Magna Carta was not so much of a brand new set of laws, but essentially a restoration of existing customs and practices. While the meaning and especially symbolism around the Magna Carta has evolved over time, this incident in 1215 set up a key expectation that even the king was not above the law. This indeed is the crystallization of the concept of the rule of law. the concept where the body of law is distinct from the lawmakers, from the crown, from the sovereign himself.
Common folk, common sense.
So let's see why all this matters to our larger theme here, innovation and progress. The dichotomy I mentioned in the intro is that between bottom-up and top-down. This matters, as I said, because it's a foundational principle concerning all organization, human, natural, technological, institutional, and thus, in a sense, a question relevant to all of reality itself. Allow me to make my case. Let's first look at the simple concept of a common law contract. As we saw in the initial story, a contract, say a page of details, is a binding agreement between two ordinary individuals, enforced in cases of dispute by the courts. Think about this for a moment. It means that ordinary men and women can, in effect, create law. Completely common folk. Wholly grassroots. Entirely bottom-up. They need have no legal training, no professional qualification, no permission from anyone. Just follow the existing practice, and the mighty apparatus of the state can be availed of should you need it. That's it. This is not to say the state doesn't have the bigger say. In cases where your contract violates some existing statute, the statute would override your contract. To what extent a country's legal infrastructure is available to everyone is a much thorny issue and can be discussed, but still. Consider the idea of common law precedent. It means that time and effort expended in the adjudication process in a previous similar case can be reused, saving more time and effort in the current instance. And given this is by the courts rather than the legislature, this reflects and adapts more readily and dynamically to the practical circumstances of people and developments in society. Under common law, a great many legal realities are not written down, or at least not codified in the formal sense. For example, in most common law jurisdictions, a good part of how contracts work, how the courts enforce them, is based on such custom and precedent rather than statutory instruments legislated for by the executive. Although there would be statutory qualifications and additions that have grown around the core customary principles. As a typical example, the contract your telephone provider offers you cannot violate consumer protection laws. Let's take an even more interesting example. In many common law jurisdictions, including the United Kingdom and many U.S. states, there is no statutory legislation enacted against the act of murder. Yes, murder. Whilst there are statutory instruments around murder, such as the Homicide Act 1957, the core act of murder itself has never been fully legislated against and remains fundamentally a common law expectation.
Of the folk, off the folk.
I am not saying the Anglo-Saxon system is somehow exceptional or superior to the way things developed in societies independently across the world. There were and no doubt persist a great many imperfections in the system, just as in any other, and even where some people see it as perfect or exalted, others might have reason to disagree for other reasons. But there are some particular, even peculiar, aspects of the Anglo-Saxon developments that I think gives us something to think about. We talk about the need to democratize this and democratize that, but let's wonder at a system where semi-literate men and women can have direct access to the legal apparatus in society. We talk about and idolize Athenian democracy as the roots of our democracy, but as we saw in the story of the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their descendant groups previously mentioned, and as I hope to have shown here, there is value to how some of these emerged and are still in operation. I sought to explore and understand the specifically extraordinary story of the ancient Greeks in episode 23. But what about the Anglo-Saxons? What was different? Hold on to that question, for I'll come back to it. As we saw in episode 17, the state by definition is a top-down institution. But how many of our affairs as they are currently managed are really optimally managed by top-down institutions? Maybe a combination of the top-down and bottom-up. And we saw in episode 27 how the most meticulously crafted top-down system, such as the 4,000 rules Sanskrit grammar book that defined every single aspect of the correct language, was eventually still subverted. Workarounds found whilst all the while technically conforming to the stated rules. In the same piece, I raised the point about national constitutions along the same lines. So leading on from there, let's ask ourselves this. Why is it that we think a committee of clever longbeards can sit down and think through all of human affairs and craft this single long document purporting to encode the expectation of the conduct of all society in all cases, scenarios, and circumstances, and for all time into the future?